I'll be talking about climate change, security, and foreign policy in China. What my paper does and what I will do for my talk today is to begin by explaining briefly sort of scientific evidence, demographic and economic evidence that we have that climate change could pose a security threat. Both, I think that I won't spend time on, to the extent that we have characterized this as a global threat, that this is, more of a discussion of climate science itself, which I won't cover today, but more on it as a national threat to China and a regional threat to the neighbors, China's neighbors. Then I'll talk a bit about China's domestic response to climate change, both in terms of its response to climate change, both its domestic response in terms of its policy responses, and its international response, primarily in the context of the international climate change negotiations under the UN. Then talk a bit about China's options going forward in light of both how international actors are likely to react to China's response going forward, and also in light of the domestic energy system constraints that China faces. And so my work, I want to say, very much comes from this side of looking at China's own energy system, both the technical resource characteristics and how that in turn shapes in many ways its domestic and international policy responses to climate change. So of course, China, as we've heard, is facing many current and future environmental challenges. Air pollution, water pollution, which compounds against water scarcity, land degradation and desertification. China's reliance on coal, which in fact has been increasing in recent years. The fact that the share of energy-intensive industries in China has also been increasing in recent years, despite many efforts to try to make this a smaller portion of the economy. And then, of course, the fact that China is now the largest emitter of greenhouse gases, and of course, many of these things are interrelated. I'll be focusing on this final point, and of course, just to remind ourselves, China is the largest emitter of greenhouse gases on an annual basis now, although their per capita emissions are still about a quarter of those of the United States, for example. Canada, I don't know, probably roughly the same. And the cumulative emissions in terms of China's contribution over the past century, which is, of course, what we care more about on a scientific basis, because for example, a molecule of carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for 100 years or more, are also much lower. And it's these second 2 points, of course, that the Chinese government will be the first to point out when looking at their overall responsibility in the global climate challenge, while the US and others would point to this, the first one, again, being the largest emitter on an annual basis. Much of China's emissions are driven by their reliance on coal. China is the largest coal consumer and producer in the world. The US is number 2. Coal is still contributing to about 2/3 of primary energy and about 80% of electricity generation in China. And apologies for this being very much in a US context, this is where I'm usually presenting, but China consumes over twice the coal of the United States, so the scale is still quite different, even though they're number 1 and number 2. China is very far ahead in terms of number 1. And in terms of what we're seeing in China, you hear 1 to 2 coal power plants a week being installed. That's about right. If you're looking at gigawatt scale coal plants. The good news is that many of these are more efficient plants than the ones that are being shut down, which are also that's happening at an impressive rate as well. But in recent years, we've seen the share of coal in China's electricity generation increase despite its efforts to decarbonize, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And then, of course, in terms of where China's greenhouse gas emissions are going, it's really exponential growth almost, and while projections have been very difficult to do well because of very different factors driving emissions growth, we've seen some very unexpected both decreases and increases more recently in emissions trajectories. You're looking at roughly a 400% increase above 1990 levels by 2030. What happened there? So climate change, I think, is often spoken about as a threat multiplier. So of course, many of the threats that we're likely to see stem from climate change really are, you're looking at things that are already in place, and climate change can actually add to the threat that many of these issues are already creating, and particularly in the context of China. So climate change will affect water supply, which is already a big issue, food security, migration issues, public health, and economic growth. And because of the sheer size of China, any national impacts will, by default, immediately have regional and potentially global consequences because of the scale of the emissions and the scale of the threats. So I wanted to first just show you a few maps that I put together for some other research I had done to try to really get a look at how some of the demographic and economic and resource data plays out in the context of China's geography. Many of these statistics won't be surprising to those of you who study China, but of course if you just look at where population is based in China, the vast majority of people on the eastern part of the country, this is the red you see here. The big yellow circles you see show the percent of minority population within each province. So of course you see much larger minority populations in the northern, western, and southwestern parts of China. If you then look a bit at some broad economic indicators for the country, what this map is showing in terms of the dark green are provinces that rely on agricultural output for a larger percentage of their economic growth. So you can see that much of really the whole eastern part of China really still very much depends on agriculture to fuel their economies. And many of these regions, the little plants you see here, are provinces that much of the land is either under a flood region or drought region. So annually you see large problems related to drought or to floods within areas that are heavily agricultural dependent. And this is prior to climate change potentially making this more of a problem. Looking at water, not surprisingly, you see the darker blue provinces are the provinces with a larger water resource measured on a per capita basis. So of course the Western China having not just a smaller population, but much of China's water supply tied up particularly in Tibetan region. And if you look at these circles, are showing you per capita water use in each of these provinces. And the red dots showing you provinces with a water deficit, so where demand exceeds supply. Of course, northern China really problematic in terms of having extreme water scarcity. And finally, looking at energy resources, of course, we talked about how China they use a lot of coal, they have a lot of coal, but the coal is located primarily in provinces where the people aren't, where the electricity demand also is not. So there's a lot of coal that has to be moved around the country. These are the dark red provinces you see here. The yellow circles are showing you hydropower potential. So, of course, much of China's hydropower potential is in the west and southwestern areas, again, where much of the water is. But, of course, much of that water resources is under threat and is being moved to the parts of the country that also need it. So multiple uses, and this is sort of the layout of two of China's major energy resources. So looking at these sort of four different maps, it occurs to me, there's maybe three areas that I would call hotspots for environmental, demographic, and potential security threats. Looking at eastern coastal China, of course, a big population center, also an economic center, also an area of very low elevation, which I'll talk more about, and therefore very susceptible to sea level rise and other climate-related impacts. Northern China, which is, of course, water scarce, also very coal dependent and agriculture dependent. And southwestern China and the Tibetan Plateau region, which of course has a relatively low population, a very large share of minority population, very water rich and hydropower dependent. So looking at how climate change interacts with these various systems, looking at agriculture, ecosystems, human livelihood, and economic development and trade, of course these three systems all interact. And all of the different climate impacts, such as melting glaciers, decreasing precipitation, increasing storms and flooding, severe weather events, and sea level rise, all both directly and indirectly will impact each of these regions. So just to give one example, if we look specifically at how economic impacts driven by climate change might affect coastal China, we see projections of sea level rise up to 1 meter by the year 2050 on China's eastern coastline. which, looking at the topography of that region, would submerge an area along the eastern coast about the size of Portugal. The majority of Shanghai is less than 2 meters above sea level, so of course very susceptible to flooding and to sea level rise. China's 12 coastal provinces, of course, very important for both population density and for economic growth. Sorry, 15, that's not wrong, it should be, I think it's 73% of GDP, or that's a typo. And then looking at, of course, the major ports, the major coastal port regions on the eastern coast, Shanghai, Tianjin, and Guangzhou, all very important economic centers for freight passing through for trade and for trade-related economic growth. Extreme weather events in China already have been costing quite a bit in terms of economic estimates about the damages that they're causing, potentially $26 billion in 2006 alone. That's a World Bank estimate. And then, of course, declining agricultural yields are predicted under future climate effects, and this is already a $400 million a year export industry, not to mention the domestic industry. A couple of just threats I want to point out is to human security in particular from climate change. I think a lot of these are going to be addressed in later sessions more today. But disease, of course, climate change increases disease incidence and transmission, particularly associated with tropical diseases. China being sort of on the boundary, several lines where tropical diseases are prevalent. And of course, heat-related disease as well. And then there's, of course, the threat of civil unrest driven by water security, in particular in some of these provinces where you're likely to see water being exported to other parts of the country that are deemed a higher priority. These are already areas with a lot of ethnic tensions and other issues, so you could see this as being a potential area where you could see, refugees, immigration tensions, and other tensions escalate in coming years. I'd now like to move to looking at how China has responded to climate change. Now, in terms of its international role, China has ratified the United Nations Framework Convention and the Kyoto Protocol, but as a non-Annex 1 or developing country, it is not bound to emissions reductions under either of these treaties. China has adopted many high-level resolutions and action plans domestically, and their key focus has really been on domestic efforts in this regard. I'm going to talk a bit about 2 areas where they've done quite a bit of energy efficiency and renewable energy. Again, I do want to highlight that energy is very much at the core of China's climate problem and how they therefore are directing their response and their plan to mitigate emissions. So I won't go into all of these in detail for time, but as you may know, China has a national level energy intensity target. This is part of the 11th five-year plan to reduce the energy intensity of the economy. This is energy measured per unit of GDP. 20% below 2005 levels by the end of this year, 2010. And this is significant in terms of their trying to achieve this. They've got many programs in place to try to help them reach that target. One that I'd like to highlight is the Top 1,000 program. It targets roughly 1,000 of the largest energy consuming enterprises in China. Those enterprises represent about a third of overall energy consumption nationally and about half of industrial energy consumption. And each of these companies that were targeted for this program had to do a very intensive monitoring and verification system to try to do a benchmarking of their energy efficiency and improve their practices. So just I want to show briefly what's been happening in terms of energy intensity trends in China. During the 2 decades from 1980 to roughly 2002, China was able to decrease its energy intensity at a very rapid rate. So basically during this period, what this means is they were able to roughly quadruple economic output while only doubling their energy consumption. And this is a very, if you look at international comparisons of how other countries have been able to do this, this is a rate of energy intensity decrease that we haven't seen in any other country repeated in history. This changed in the 3-year period between 2002 to 2005, where energy intensity increased for the first time in decades, and this caught the attention of the leadership in China. Because this is the opposite direction they want to be going in when the economy is growing as quickly as it is. They want to be using energy as carefully as possible. And so this increase was what really, well, first of all, it drove off all the projections of China's greenhouse gas emissions and was what made them, for example, pass the the United States and become #1 several years before anyone had expected, decades before anyone had expected, according to a lot of estimates. And it was also the driving force behind these energy intensity programs that I mentioned. So since then, they've been relatively successful at decreasing energy intensity. They've at least been able to reverse this curve. But they are still a ways from meeting the 20% target by the end of this year. They were, the National Development Reform Commission reported they were at about 15.6% decline from the 2006 to 2009 period. This was reported just a few weeks ago, so they've got a ways to go, and now they're sort of looking forward to the next targets that will be part of the 12 5-year plan and even the 13 5-year plan. Slightly less ambitious, but still the 16–17% range. And of course, this matters because if you hadn't had this decrease in energy intensity in China, if their ratio of energy use to economic output had stayed where it was in, for example, 1977, they'd be using 3 times the amount of energy they are today. So, China already the largest energy user in the world, they could be 3 times where they are if they weren't making these energy efficiency improvements, and that's why this is really such a priority of the government. And this is just some analysis that some of my colleagues at Lawrence Berkeley Lab did to try to show where these energy intensity savings were coming from, and this just gives you a snapshot of the types of programs that I mentioned, which are contributing to this reduction in energy intensity. So moving to renewables, there's also quite a bit happening in this area in China. This is where a lot of my own research focuses. There's a national level renewable energy law in place, many aggressive targets. And China is really developing the first in the world gigawatt scale of wind and solar facilities. So this is substantial. Quite a bit happening in this area. And just to give you some illustrations from what's happening in the wind industry, China was the largest wind market in the world last year in terms of annual installations, and you can just see from this graph in the last decade. This shows, the red shows you the China's percentage of total global wind installations. So the center of gravity of where all the new wind towers being installed is just moving from the rest of the world all over to China. And another notable thing that's been happening in this industry, as well as in many other clean technology industries, is that it's now, these technologies are being manufactured more and more by Chinese-owned companies. So just 5 years ago, or 4 years ago, the wind turbines that were being installed in China were majority coming from foreign-owned companies that were selling their wind turbines in China, mostly manufacturing them at that point in China, but still not Chinese-owned technology. By last year, this has changed substantially. So just in a 4-year period, it went from Chinese companies having 40% to 82% of market share. So this is quite substantial. And you see similar things happening in solar photovoltaics, where China is the largest manufacturer of this technology now in the world. Although you see one very different thing happening here, which is that while China leads on the production side of this technology, it's almost all being exported outside of China. This is the opposite with wind turbines, where almost all of the technology is being used within China rather than being exported. And I mention this because this is starting to have other international relations implications with how other countries are viewing China's own trade practices, which I'll talk about in a minute. But lastly, I want to mention that China has announced its intention to implement a carbon intensity target. So this really builds upon the energy intensity target, but this is a carbon target, the first of its kind in China, and something that most other countries still haven't enshrined in their own domestic law. 40 to 45% reduction, again, in carbon emissions per economic growth below 2005 levels by 2020. It is indexed to economic growth, so this is not a hard absolute cap on emissions. But it still, I think, will be challenging to meet depending on what happens with economic growth rates. This target was announced leading up to the UN negotiations in Copenhagen, but and while China did put it in the appendix to the Copenhagen Accord, which was agreed to there, they've been very clear about pointing out that this is not in any way an internationally binding commitment that they've adopted. This is very much a domestic policy that they're happy to have the international world recognize, the international community recognize that they're not willing to be bound to it in that context. Of course, this goes along with many of the other policies and programs they already have in place. These are all going to help them meet this target. But the new thing that you see with this target is that China has never before really been keeping track of carbon emissions. All the numbers that I've given you about their trends and rates, these are international statistical bureaus. The last official national greenhouse gas inventory that was released from China to the UN was in the year 2000, and it was 1994 estimate. So 1994 emissions are the last official data that are available for China's emissions, and of course their emissions have changed quite a bit since 1994. So this, I think, if nothing else, this target is going to be very important for increasing the measurement and accounting of emissions, which are really fundamental to any new programs and policies to then be implemented. And it's very important for the enforcement and verification of these policies, either domestically or internationally. And very important for building trust, therefore, amongst other actors who look at China and what they're doing and don't believe a lot of the targets and numbers they put on the table, and whether or not they're actually going to be able to meet them. So I go into this in more detail in my paper, and I won't a lot right now for time, but in the context of the climate negotiations, we see China acting really quite differently on this issue than they do in their domestic rhetoric and domestic actions. In the negotiations, China does not want to be viewed as a leader. Doesn't want to be taking the lead up either among the developing countries or across the developed and developing world. Very much sides with the G77, the rest of the developing countries, and this has been pretty consistent throughout the history of the climate negotiations, with some deviation from this. Although in Copenhagen just last year, you're seeing some interesting signs of the G77 not really holding together as such a unified force, and I think this is problematic for China. It's going to be interesting to see how the rest of the developing world, which was always sort of happy to have China siding with them, having their back in this global negotiation, which is very divided on a north-south basis. You see developing countries now not wanting to be grouped with China, now that China is the largest emitter, and not wanting to therefore be subject to the same pressures internationally as China is in this sphere. But that said, I think you see that, particularly in light of the United States, which is the largest developed country emitter, not taking serious domestic action on climate change, this basically leaves China off the hook as a developing country. And also really has, I think, Copenhagen in particular illustrated the power that China had in terms of holding all the cards. I mean, you had all these world leaders scrambling just to talk to Premier Wen, and the whole meeting basically had to stop while everyone was looking for him and trying to get him to meet with everybody. And I think this showed it wasn't everyone wanting to meet with President Obama, or it was really the Chinese that were just crucial to any decision being reached in Copenhagen, like it or not. And I think they know that, and they very much took advantage of that. So in terms of how the rest of the world is really looking at China in this and starting to respond, China's domestic actions, including some of the ones I detailed, are leading them already to dominate in many of these clean tech industries. But while this is happening, simultaneously their emissions are still increasing rapidly. Unfortunately, the inroads they're making in renewables, for example, are still just not sufficient in terms of scale to make a dent in their overall emissions trajectory. I mentioned they're the largest wind market in the world. Wind is still less than 1% of total electricity generation, coal still holding steady at 80%. So it's going to be a while before these technologies can really make a large impact. And this, I think, is really one of the reasons that you see growing trade tensions in these low-carbon industries between China and other actors like the United States, because you have this situation where no country wants to take what is perceived as painful economic actions to cut their emissions, but the only sort of positive side that we hear people selling is that, well, if we do this, there'll be green jobs, there'll be all these new green industries, and we can transform to a low-carbon economy. China is taking advantage of that, and they're getting all these benefits of the low-carbon economy and green jobs, but they're not cutting their emissions and sort of seen as having to make any difficult economic sacrifices. And so I think this is what causes real tensions with the United States in particular, where they were hoping in many ways, I think, to dominate in these industries, and they see China out in front in many ways. I think there's some real questions still about sort of long-term success of these industries, the innovative capabilities within these industries, but I think there's been some very shrewd actions taken on behalf of China, and the question will be, what actions will be taken to retaliate against China, whether it's a trade measure taken in terms of U.S. climate legislation where all imports from China are subject to some sort of border adjustment or carbon tax, which is being was very heavily debated in the Senate and this past year. Or there's been a new WTO investigation launched just a couple weeks ago against China's clean tech subsidies because of concern about how this is hurting U.S. industry. So you could see a WTO dispute totally dominate the discussions that are happening on international climate change cooperation, and in some ways, really moving us away from a constructive approach of bilateral cooperation, which we're also trying to pursue, and moving more into the sphere of retaliation and competition. So I'll end with just, I think that it's increasingly clear, the science is increasingly clear that China is going to face severe impacts from climate change. And if anything, I think this could be a key driver of domestic action to reduce emissions. I think the leadership in China is very closely watching, this science, that it is most of Chinese scientists that are leading a lot of this research to understand what the implications will be for China. And I think if anything is going to drive their future action to be more rigorous, this is certainly one area as opposed to international pressure, which tends to be less significant. And in particular, the security and areas that I mentioned surrounding the eastern coast and the western Himalayan region, which I think we'll hear about later. But international retaliation is also a big risk, and the longer China sort of plays this role of being the leader of the clean tech industry without having to take any real sacrifices and make any major changes, there's going to be increasing trade battles, and I think the U.S. will certainly be at the center. And so it's going to be all the more important to really reframe this to a more cooperative approach to clean energy innovation and development to avoid that happening.